Ladies and gentlemen, this is the Trinidad Titan, a.k.a. Hollywood Smooth, Justin Smooth, OVW two-time heavyweight champion. You are listening to the Dave Dynasty Show.
My little itty-bitty bruiser buddies.
United States heavyweight champion, Brazil. The world's heavyweight champion from the AWA, Nick Bockwinkel.
The Midwest supporting, bruiser loving, positivity spreading, world's most dangerous podcast. Join former pro wrestler and promoter Dave Dynasty as he supports and promotes Midwest pro wrestling. Keep on growing with the Midwest Express. This is the Dave Dynasty Show.
What is up to all the great listeners of the Dave Dynasty Show? My name is the director, Con Howse, from In Your Howse, and I was asked by my friend and respected colleague Dave to come on and guest host for this very special topic. Now, guys, it is Black History Month, a time where we commemorate the considerable achievements and contributions of African Americans in the United States, and representation is so important. So when Dave asked me to come on and do this, I was not only thrilled, but honored to come on and do this, because this is no different. Wrestling is no different, guys, because the topic of the show is African American wrestlers and the WWA, that's World Wrestling Association Indianapolis, and their impact. And it'll be by John Lawson, historian and friend of the show, and will include talent such as former WWA heavyweight champion Bobo Brazil, Ernie Ladd, Sailor Art Thomas, plus many other great and talented wrestlers that have come through the territory. So guys, when we come back from break, you will hear from John Lawson.
Hey, make sure you visit DaveDynasty.com. That is your central hub for everything within the world of the Dave Dynasty Show. From there, you can find links to follow us on all of our social media accounts. We are on Facebook, Twitter, Instagram, and of course YouTube, which you will want to subscribe to our YouTube channel. We have lots of classic wrestling, every episode of the podcast, and other exclusive features there. While you're at DaveDynasty.com, check out the links to help financially support the show. That is how we keep this free every week. You can go to ProWrestlingTees.com/The Dave Dynasty and buy a shirt to help us out. PayPal.me/The Dave Dynasty to make a one-time financial contribution. Patreon.com/The Dave Dynasty to make ongoing monthly contributions. Or you can click our affiliate links for Amazon.com and HighSpots.com. No additional charge to you, but it helps us out. Thank you for your support, and check out DaveDynasty.com. Complete your experience, The Dave Dynasty Show.
Since 2001, drug companies dumped 1 billion opioid pills in West Virginia, causing over 3,000 overdose deaths and thousands of babies born addicted by no fault of their own. I'm attorney Stephen New. If you're the grandparent or guardian of a child born with neonatal abstinence syndrome, call me. I'll help you seek just compensation.
Call the law offices of Stephen P. New at 1-844-BAD-PILLS before time runs out.
With February being Black History Month, we've decided that we'll take a look at many of the African American wrestlers that appeared in the WWA. There were several women wrestlers that appeared in the WWA, and last year when I profiled the main women, I spoke about Princess Jasmine, a very popular and fine wrestler out of the Chicago area. But in addition to Princess Jasmine, we also had the likes of Ramona Isabel and Marva Scott, who were two of the best during their time. They wrestled from the 1950s all the way into the early 80s. Marva Scott was part of a family of 3 sisters, all of whom wrestled and were acclaimed athletes. Her sisters were Babs Wingo and Ethel Johnson, and you can find some of their matches on the internet, and they're worth taking a look at. We also invite you to visit DaveDynasty.com, as you'll see links to many WWA matches, including entire 60-minute programs that it will include the studio interviews between matches. There were a few African-American midget wrestlers that appeared in the WWA in the 60s and 70s. Bobo Johnson is one that comes to mind. I believe the Haiti Kid is another that made some appearances. In the early days of the WWA, Sweet Daddy Siki appeared in Indianapolis. I never got to see him in person, and he is one of the few that I will speak of today that are still with us, as most have already passed away. Siki seemed to be placed in the middle of the card and was never elevated to main events or semi-mains before he had left the territory. Tom Jones is another that appeared in the WWA in the 60s and into the early 70s. After retiring, he became very outspoken against Bruiser for what he felt were low payoffs, but he always seemed to have good things to say about Wilbur Snyder. Next, we'll take a brief look at the king of the cocoa butt, Bobo Brazil, perhaps the most famous African-American wrestler of all time, or at least until The Rock came along. Bobo started wrestling in the early 1950s, we believe it was 1951, and he did not retire until after he had competed in the ring for over 40 years. Bobo would make appearances throughout the 60s and 70s and into the early 80s into the WWA, but really did not become a performer that would appear on the entire circuit until the 1970s. Living in Michigan, he was frequently wrestling for the Sheik's promotion, but by probably around 1978 or 79 or so, he seemed to put his focus on wrestling out of the Indianapolis territory instead of Detroit. Bobo would come in anytime that you needed to have a big named, famous babyface to go against the heel champion, or to be involved in feuds that perhaps Bruiser was having with other tag teams, to be his partner off and on. He did win gold in the WWA. He held the WWA World Heavyweight Championship twice. He first won it from luscious Johnny Valiant in the summer of 1981 in a match that occurred in Bartonville, Illinois, which is rather unusual since almost all of the title changes would happen in Indianapolis. There were a few that did happen in Chicago, as well as Detroit and Elkhart, and I believe Fort Wayne. But this one occurred in Bartonville, Illinois. And I can remember the night that I was at the Expo Center, and back in the backstage area, in walks Bobo, and he's carrying the championship with him over his shoulder. And I was talking to Johnny Valiant and didn't realize he was no longer the champion, and asked him what had happened. He goes, "Oh yeah, Bobo beat me for the title." And that one was kind of unexpected, mainly just because it occurred in a spot show rather than one of the main cities in the territory. Bobo lost the title in the fall of '81 to Blackjack Mulligan, and that occurred in Indianapolis. But right after winning the title, Mulligan decided to leave the area. Now, he was only flying in to appear in Indianapolis. He was not making shots in any of the other towns. But he was promoting in Knoxville, Tennessee at the time. And with him having what was probably less money than he was expecting to be paid for making his appearances in Indianapolis, he just decided not to come back, and the belt was given back to Bobo, with the title supposedly changing hands in Knoxville. Bobo would go ahead and hold the title into 1982, when he lost the title to Harley Race, and that was the last time that he held the world title, although he did challenge for it a few more times. In 1985, he also became half of the tag team champions in the WWA, with Chris Carter as his partner for a short period of time. Bobo lived to be 73 years of age. He passed away in 1998. And anyone that ever saw Bobo would always remember him, as he was one of the all-time fan favorites. Everywhere he went, I believe he was a career baby face, with the possible exception of appearances in Japan, where almost all the Americans would have been heels in the 60s. Ernie Ladd is another one of the most famous African-American wrestlers, and he had a lot of matches in the WWA. He, of course, was a professional football player. He was in the AFL, the American Football League, before the AFL and NFL merged into one league. During the off-season, he would take up wrestling, just like Dick the Bruiser had done in the 50s and many others. And by the late 60s, before the merger of the two leagues, he had decided to go into to leave football and to go into pro wrestling full time. He would make appearances as both a face and a heel in the 60s, but he really made his mark in the early 1970s when he came in wearing a crown as the King of Wrestling, and he became part of Bobby Heenan's stable that included Blackjack Lanza, Blackjack Mulligan, and Baron von Raschke. I remember quite well back in, it had to be either 72 or 73, Lad making appearances before he would wrestle, would come to the ring wearing the crown, and they would do live interviews in the ring. And this was mainly because he was not going to be able to make the TV tapings that were held during the middle of the week, since he was appearing all over the country and all over the world for that matter. So they would just do them in the ring. So he would wear a suit and he would wear his crown into the ring. And he really generated a lot of heat with this gimmick. He would come in there and say, "Bow down, peasants. I am your king." And he probably gained as much heat as any heel ever did in the WWA. The only others that would perhaps come to mind would be, of course, the Sheik, and perhaps King Kong Brody would be the other. But in my mind, I'm thinking that Ernie Ladd might have even been more hated whenever he was the King of Wrestling than even the Sheik was in Indianapolis. He feuded with Bruiser for a while. There's a famous cover of the Wrestler magazine, one of the leading newsstand magazines at the time, where Bruiser had taken the crown away from him and put it on his head. And another thing that Von Raschke, or another thing that Ernie Ladd would do would be that he would have his thumb taped up, and it was supposed to be a football injury that had never healed. And he would use that to his advantage whenever the referee wasn't looking. He would jam the thumb into the throat of his opponents, and oftentimes that would gain him pinfall victories against just about everybody except Dick the Bruiser. Ladd would frequently wrestle twice on the shows during that time, and as we've pointed out in other historical pieces, that was often done for TV purposes so that you could have a wrestler, especially a newcomer into the area, be taped for two shows instead of just one to get them more exposure on TV. But one thing that was different about this at that time was that they actually began promoting Ernie Ladd as having a warm-up match on cards. And he would be going in against what you would have to consider strictly enhancement talent. Sometimes he would come into the ring in his street clothes against these jobbers, and he would say that he's going to refuse to wrestle them because they were not in his same league, and he didn't want to get his hands dirty with them. Sometimes he would talk down to them, but then would also even offer his hand as a handshake, making that gesture. But as soon as they would outreach their hand to accept the handshake, that's whenever he would attack, and he would beat them down and pin them within a minute or two to generate heat. Ernie became one half of the tag team champions in 1973 in a match that surprised me at the time that they captured the belts. It was Ernie Ladd and Baron von Raschke teaming up together, being managed by Bobby the Brain Heenan, at the time still being called Pretty Boy Bobby Heenan in the WWA. And since Baron von Raschke was already the world heavyweight champion in the WWA, I really didn't expect this title change to take place, but it did. Baron held both belts for a short period of time. He dropped the world title to Bob Ellis first, and then later in 1973, Von Raschke and Ladd were defeated by Bruiser and Bruno Sammartino. Over the next almost 10 years, Ladd would come in every once in a while, sometimes as a heel, sometimes as a face. I know he was brought in to be Bruiser's tag team partner to go against the Valiant Brothers whenever they had their first title reign in the WWA. He also came in as a baby face to challenge Ox Baker for the world title. He came back in 1980 and became the singles champion for the first and only time. This time he was managed by Reverend Tiny Hampton. That's another wrestler that we'll be talking about here shortly. And he defeated Bruiser on November 1st of 1980. And 4 weeks later, right back at the next show in Indianapolis on November 29th, Bruiser regained the title. And Ladd was kind of in and out of the territory in a short period of time. Prince Pons is one that wrestled in the WWA from the early 60s into the 1970s, and he was a mainstay with his home base in Indianapolis. He was the trainer for the WWA. Anytime Bruiser was wanting to develop new talent, Pons was the man that would be their instructor, and he was the man that was instrumental in training Bobby Heenan, and was Heenan's very first opponent in the ring. Pons was mainly a preliminary to perhaps mid-card wrestler, although he did get elevated to a main event in Indianapolis by teaming with Bruiser against the Blackjacks, and he was somebody that was always in great physical condition. I can remember as just a little kid, probably meeting him for the first time when I was either 8 or 9 years old. And one thing that I saw in the locker room when my father would take me there was that Pons was somebody that would spend a lot of time warming up in the locker room, to the point that he would work up a sweat before he would enter the ring. He'd do all kinds of calisthenics. He would jump rope, do a lot of push-ups, and that was something that I didn't see anybody else during that time doing that. Now, part of that could have been because he was often going out in the opening match, and I was down in the dressing room before the card started, and then wouldn't be there whenever the other matches would be taking place. But I think he was one of the few that did that. Another thing that stands out about Pons was that he would sometimes wear 2 pairs of trunks into the ring, and he would remove the outer pair during the introductions. I don't know why he did it, but the fans seemed to get a kick out of it. Sailor Art Thomas is another one that was featured in the WWA throughout his probably his entire career. He started wrestling in the 1950s, and he wrestled well into his 50s. He was a very large man, probably 6.5 feet tall, and somewhere in the neighborhood of 250 to 260 pounds. Always in great physical condition. He had a bodybuilder's physique during a time that most wrestlers did not have that. I found some records that he may have actually begun his career in the ring in 1943, and he continued to wrestle to the 1980s. Wikipedia says he retired in 1981, but I believe he even wrestled into 1982, and that would give him approximately a 40-year career in the ring. Sailor Art Thomas held numerous championships all over the United States. He also teamed with Bobo Brazil in Detroit and was the tag team champion team there. And like Bobo, he's also a WWE Hall of Fame honoree. Early in his career, instead of being called Sailor Art Thomas, he was Seaman Art Thomas. And you could tell that Chicago promoter Bob Luce was responsible for putting together the programs that were sold in Indianapolis, as the lineup sheets always referred to him as Seaman Art Thomas instead of Sailor Art Thomas, whereas the Seaman terminology had morphed into Sailor many years before that. Thomas died of cancer in the year 2003, which made him 79 years of age. He made his last appearance in Indiana as a guest for promoter Jeff Cohen for Championship Wrestling of Indiana on one of their weekly Thursday night events in the mid-1990s. I unfortunately missed that show, but he was brought in not to be a competitor, as he was long since retired at that time, but to make a guest appearance. And he did get involved in an angle where he, I believe, punched one of the leading heels in the promotion at the time. Rufus R. Jones is another wrestler that made a number of appearances in the WWA, primarily in the latter part of his career. In researching Jones, I found that he was born in 1933, and it shows that he had his first match in 1969, which would put him at 35 or 36 years of age, which would be somewhat old for a debut for a wrestler that made it to the top of the cards for most of his career. So I'm guessing he may have actually started earlier. Rufus became a mainstay in the WWA in the early 80s. He teamed up with Wilbur Snyder. They did not capture the tag team title, but Rufus did have some main events against Harley Race when Harley was the WWA champion. Those two would have worked together many, many times in the Central States, since Kansas City would be the home base for both of them. Rufus retired in 1988, and he passed away in 1993 at only 60 years of age. Walter Johnson is an African-American wrestler from Cincinnati. He played in the NFL from 1965 all the way into 1977 for the Cleveland Browns, and then for his final year with the Cincinnati Bengals. He first started wrestling in 1968 during the NFL offseason, but I wasn't familiar with him until he came to the WWA around 1977, 78, both as a heel and as a face. But he was never really pushed, even though he was given wins over many of the preliminary wrestlers. I really can't recall if he was ever put to the test in what you would call an even matchup. He was a 3-time Pro Bowl defensive tackle. And Walter has since passed away, unfortunately. He was a very, very large man. I'd say probably 6'3" or so, and probably close to 300 pounds. Clem Turner is another former NFL player that turned to wrestling. He wrestled in Indianapolis and throughout the WWA circuit from 1972 until about 1975. He was a running back in the Canadian Football League before signing with Cincinnati for 1 year in 1969. Cincinnati is his home base. And then he played 3 more seasons with the Denver Broncos. And that's what I can remember him always being billed as in the WWA, either as a Denver Bronco or former Denver Bronco Clem Turner. It looks like he sat out of football in 1973 before joining the short-lived WFL for a year. And then after leaving football after the 74 season, he continued to wrestle into 1975. Clem Turner died in 2009. He was 64 years of age. Another African-American wrestler in the WWA was Frankie Adonis, someone who teamed with Clem Turner. His current whereabouts are unknown, so he may still be with us. I'm really not sure about that, but I can remember that in the mid-'70s he had more or less just kind of gone away and didn't really hear anything about him. But then one night at the matches, Sim Menaker talked to my father, who worked for the Athletic Commission, saying that Adonis was trying to get licensed to wrestle in Indiana once again. And according to what Menaker was saying, was that he was being denied a wrestling license, and that was because he now had a felony on his record. Now, whether or not that's true or not, I don't know. There was something that was said that it involved perhaps a shooting or at least involved a gun, but I do not know if that were really the case or not. After the commission was disbanded in the early 80s, he did return to wrestling for ICW on some shows that were held in Indiana, and he also made some appearances for the PAWA, which was the promotion that was being run in opposition to the WWA by the family of Stormy Granzig. Reverend Tiny Tim Hampton arrived in the WWA in the late 70s when he was basically winding down his career. Early on, he traveled all over the world, but settled into his home state of Ohio and wrestled primarily in Ohio and Michigan, often for Chic Farhat's Detroit promotion. He was a wrestler as well as a manager in Indianapolis, and he carried a cane with him that he called his healing stick, or the way he would call it, his healing stick. He managed tag team champions Golden Boy Paul Christie and Roger Kirby, as well as others, including Dr. Jerry Graham Jr., friend of the show. Ox Baker, he was Ernie Ladd's manager for his short title run in 1980, and he also managed Baron von Raschke whenever he was brought back into the WWA after nearly a decade absence to challenge Bruiser for the singles title. Next, we have Abdullah the Great, who was a knockoff of the more famous Abdullah the Butcher. This Abdullah dressed like the more famous Abdullah and resembled him, but he was not quite as tall nor as heavy. And, of course, he did not have the success that the Butcher had worldwide, but he did make his mark as a two-time WWA World Tag Team Champion, first with Sheik Ali Hassan and later with Gentleman Jerry Valiant. He also competed in the Memphis and Central States areas. Buster Adams had been his name in the Kentucky and Tennessee area before he adopted the Abdullah the Great gimmick. He's another that, unfortunately, has passed away. The last name that we have to take a look at today is Bill Nixon. Now, Bill was strictly a preliminary wrestler whenever I first saw him in the mid-'70s. He had a completely shaved or bald head and would wear long black tights, black boots. Really nothing about him stood out. He would put over the bigger stars. He would put over even the minor stars. But after disappearing in the mid-'70s, he came back a few years later with a minor push. After Golden Boy Paul Christie had turned heel, for some reason, they brought him back and paired him up with Christie, not really as a tag team, but as a Christie associate. And Christie would appear on TV interviews, and he would almost talk about him as if he was a pet. And one of the strange things about this gimmick that was really odd at the time was that Christie had a rope was over the head of and around the neck of Nixon, who was now being called Doorknob Nixon, dropping the Bill name, and Doorknob, I guess, because he's as bald as a doorknob. But he would lead him to the ring with this rope. Now, it was not a noose or anything like that. It was more or less like a leash. It was not tight around his neck or anything like that. But it was just a really kind of odd gimmick to see in wrestling. I can remember feeling a little bit uncomfortable about it. It kind of reminded me of what happened, a decade or so later when Sid Vicious in WCW had Harlem Heat as a tag team where he had them wearing chains. It's just one of those things that you probably really shouldn't do in wrestling. And the gimmick with Doorknob Nixon with the rope and being with Christie really didn't last but maybe 2 months or so. He did get a major win, probably the biggest win of his career, because there wouldn't have been very many to begin with. But Christie and Nixon were teamed together against Moose Cholak in a handicap tag team match where it would be 2 against 1, where the 2 as a tag team would have to tag in and out rather than both being in the ring against Cholak at the same time. And they won that match, and then I think Nixon disappeared right after that. That was a result at the time that I thought was wrong, especially since it didn't really lead to anything else. But that would have really been a better opportunity to allow Christie to keep his heat as the newly turned heel, but allow Cholak to pin Nixon would have been the result that I would have gone with, rather than having them beat him, since he didn't lead to anything else. So that concludes this week's look at many of the African-American wrestlers that competed in the WWA. I'm sure that I overlooked a few, and if I omitted one of your favorites, please forgive me. We want to thank you for listening to the Dave Dynasty Show, and be sure to check the archives for features and interviews with the legendary wrestlers of the past and current wrestlers that compete on the independent scene today in Indiana. This is John Lawson saying goodbye.
If you are looking for the best books, DVDs, and posters on classic wrestling nostalgia, then you want to visit crowbarpress.com. There are literally dozens of titles there, including biographies of the likes of Bruiser Brody, Ole Anderson, Ivan Koloff, and of course, Dick the Bruiser, as we've spoke about here on the Dave Dynasty Show. You want to visit crowbarpress.com for all of your classic wrestling nostalgia needs. Again, that is crowbarpress.com.
And there you have it, guys. Some of the great black men that come through WWA Indianapolis. Thank you to John Lawson once again for his historical and first-hand memories. Once again, my name is the director, Con Howse, from In Your Howse, and you can catch the In Your Howse podcast on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, Spreaker, Stitcher, iHeartRadio, Himalaya. If you don't have an Apple device, that's all right. We're on Google Play. Anywhere that you guys are, hey, we can get to you. You can follow me at Con Howse on Twitter, or at In Your Howse on Twitter, on Instagram, or the director, Con Howse, on Facebook, and also In Your Howse on Facebook as well, where we have 22,000 followers. You can catch me at the DDIT, that is the Dynamic Duo Invitational Tag Tournament, where I will be debuting at Upstart Pro on commentary. Moving right along to the 7th of March, I will be in Terre Haute, Indiana, on commentary for New Wave Pro, Steel City Madness. And guys, who knows? Maybe in the future, me and my good friend Dave will do a crossover episode. So please stay tuned and have yourself a happy Black History Month.